The Singularity Pulse. Part 1. The Ghost in the Well. Stardate 2249.04.12. Location Deep Space Outpost Acheron 9. Atmosphere 18% oxygen, 82% nitrogen. System status nominal decaying. The silence of the Buddha's void isn't just an absence of sound, it's a physical weight. It's the feeling of being a single grain of sand in a cathedral built for giants. At Acheron 9, perched on the absolute bleeding edge of the event horizon of the Cocytus singularity, we don't listen for music. We listen for the groan of space-time. My name is Elias Thorne. I am the last ear. Every 12 hours I recalibrate the gravitational sensors. The singularity, a black wound in the fabric of the universe, sits there, rotating, silent, devouring light. It's a perfect sphere of nothingness, wrapped in a screaming halo of gold and violet plasma. We are here to catch the crumbs, the hawking radiation, the stray particles. But 3 days ago, the math stopped making sense. Log start, 03:14 a.m. It began as a jitter in the subquantum flux. At first, I thought it was a sensor glitch, a stray cosmic ray hitting the CCD. But then it repeated. Pulse. Pause. Pulse, pulse. It wasn't coming from the accretion disk. It wasn't coming from the stars behind us. It was coming from inside the event horizon. The gravity at the center is described by a formula where it increases as the distance decreases. As one approaches the singularity, the escape velocity exceeds the speed of light. Nothing comes back. Yet the signal was there. It was a narrow-band transmission on the 1420 megahertz frequency, the hydrogen line. The universal language, Acheron 9, this is Central Command. Please confirm sensor reading 77 Delta, the AI voice of the station. Mina chirped. I see it, Mina. I whispered, my fingers dancing over the haptic interface. Run a Fourier transform on the noise. Filter the gravitational lensing. The screen flickered. The waves smoothed out into a pattern. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a greeting. It was a heartbeat. A rhythmic biological thumping that caused the very hull of the station to vibrate at a frequency of 0.8 hertz. Elias, Mina's voice shifted. She sounded concerned. No, her algorithms were just mimicking human stress. The signal is not a transmission. It is a displacement. Explain. The signal is not being sent. The space-time inside the hole is being pushed out. Something is moving against the flow of infinite gravity. I looked out the reinforced quartz window. The black disk of Cocytus seemed to bulge. The light around the edges, the photon sphere, was warping, turning from a white-hot ring into a jagged, serrated edge. How much power would it take to push back against a singularity? I asked. Mina paused for 0.4 seconds. More energy than exists in our local star cluster. Or it requires no energy at all if the laws of thermodynamics are currently being rewritten. The signal changed. The heartbeat stopped. In its place, a voice, distorted by 1 billion tons of gravitational pressure, stretched by time dilation, spoke a single word in a language that hadn't been spoken on Earth for 4,000 years. Cash Shapu, the sorcerer. I felt the blood drain from my face. My grandfather was an archaeologist. He used to tell me stories of the Sumerian gods. This wasn't a signal from a survivor. It was a signal from a tomb. Part 2. The time dilation echo. The deeper the signal went into the archives, the more the station began to fail. Light bulbs flickered. The gravity plating on deck 4 inverted for 3 seconds, pinning me to the ceiling before dropping me back down. Time is different here. Because of our proximity to the whole. 1 hour on Acheron 9 is 3 days on Earth. We are already ghosts to the people who sent us here. But the signal was moving in reverse time. Mina, replay the last 10 seconds of the Kashapu transmission, but invert the entropy scale, I commanded, wiping blood from my nose. Warning, data integrity is at 40%. The gravitational shear is increasing. The audio played. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was the sound of 1,000 glass bells shattering in a vacuum. Underneath the bells, there was a scratching sound, like a fingernail on a chalkboard. But the chalkboard was my own skull. Wait, I said, leaning closer to the monitor. Look at the waveform. The waveform didn't look like sound. When plotted in 3 dimensions, it formed a map, a geometric coordinate system. It wasn't pointing to a star. It was pointing to a set of coordinates inside the station. The signal wasn't coming from the black hole anymore. It had arrived. Mina, internal sensors. Now, internal sensors reporting a thermal anomaly in the cargo bay, Mina replied. Her voice was becoming sluggish, her syllables stretching out. Temperature. Absolute zero. No. Below absolute zero. Elias, the laws of physics are. Error 404. Logic loop. I grabbed the heavy-duty mag torch and ran. The corridors felt longer than they should be. The walls were sweating a dark, iridescent oil that smelled like ozone and old wet earth. Every step I took felt like I was walking through molasses. Time dilation wasn't just happening near the hole, it was happening in my lungs. I could feel my heart beat once every 10 seconds. I reached the cargo bay. The heavy blast doors were frosted over white veins of ice spreading across the steel. I bypassed the lock and stepped inside. In the center of the room, floating 6 inches off the floor, was a rift. It wasn't a hole. It was a vertical slit in reality, about 3 feet tall. It looked like a tear in a piece of black silk. Through the slit, I didn't see the cargo bay. I didn't see the station. I saw a desert under a green sun. And standing in the sand, looking back at me, was a figure in a suit that looked like my own, but it was covered in ancient, etched runes. The figure raised a hand. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Iles, the figure said. The voice didn't come from the rift. It came from my own radio. Do not close the door. We have been trying to get out for 10,000 years. For you, it has been a week. For us, the Singularity is a library that never ends. Who are you? I screamed, the mag torch trembling in my grip. The figure stepped closer to the rift. The faceplate of its helmet cleared. It was me. But it was a me that had aged 1,000 years. My eyes were milky white, and my skin was tattooed with the stars of galaxies that hadn't even formed yet. I am the signal, the older Elias said, and you are the echo. If you don't jump in, the universe ends. If you do jump in, you will become the god of the void. Part 3. The geometry of the impossible. The air in the cargo bay didn't just feel cold. It felt wrong. It was as if the molecules had forgotten how to bounce off one another. I stood there, staring at the older version of myself, a version that had been marinated in the radiation of a dying star and the silence of 1 billion years. Jump? I found my voice, though it sounded like dry parchment tearing. You're asking me to step into a gravitational grave? If I cross that threshold, my atoms will be spaghettified. I'll be a string of carbon, a light year long. The older Elias shook his head. His movements were fluid, but there was a strange strobe effect to them, as if he were occupying several positions in space at once. The math they taught you at the academy is a lie of convenience, he said, his voice echoing through my helmet's internal comms, bypassing the air entirely. They told you the singularity is a point of infinite density. They told you it's the end of the line. It's not. It's a floating point. It is the place where the napkin of the universe is tucked into its own pocket. He reached out, and his hand, clad in that rune-etched glove, crossed the boundary of the rift. Where his hand entered my world, the air sparked with blue static. The smell of ozone became a physical punch to the gut. Acheron 9 is already falling, the older Elias continued. Mina isn't glitching because of a hardware failure. She's glitching because she's starting to process the data from the other side. She's realizing that 1 plus 1 only equals 2 if you stay on the surface of the pond. We are at the bottom now. Suddenly, the station groaned, a deep tectonic shudder that threw me against the bulkhead. Red emergency lights flared, casting the cargo bay in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Warning, Mina's voice returned, but it was layered with 1,000 subharmonics. Structural integrity at 12%. The Cocytus singularity has shifted its mass. We are being pulled into the ergosphere. Time dilation factor is now infinite. I looked at my chronometer. The seconds weren't ticking. The numbers were spinning so fast they became a blur. Then they started counting backward. I was watching the birth and death of the universe in the reflection of my watch face. If I jump, I shouted over the roar of the collapsing station, what happens to the Earth? What happens to the signal? You are the signal, the older Elias roared back. The transmission you heard 3 days ago, that was you, 30,000 years from now, screaming back through the wormhole to make sure you were listening. It's a closed loop, Elias. If you don't jump, the loop breaks and the singularity expands to swallow the entire Bootis void. You are the plug in the drain. The floor tilted at a 45-degree angle. The rift began to widen, tearing the metal walls of the cargo bay like they were made of wet cardboard. Beyond the hull, I could see the accretion disk of Cocytus, no longer a distant glow, but a wall of fire that filled the sky. I looked at the hand of my future self. I looked at the void. I jumped. Part 4. The Library of Fallen Light. There was no pain. There was no crushing weight. Passing through the event horizon felt like stepping out of a noisy room into a soundproof chamber. One moment, there was the screeching of tearing metal and the wail of sirens. The next, there was a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. I wasn't falling. I was floating in a space that defied every law of Euclidean geometry. Imagine a city made of frozen light. Imagine skyscrapers built from the memories of dead suns, stretching in directions that shouldn't exist, up, down, left, right, and through. This was the interior of Cocytus. Welcome to the Kronos Arp, the older Elias said. He was standing next to me now, but he wasn't just one person. He was a trail of ghosts, a long line of Eliases stretching back into the shadows and forward into a bright, shimmering haze. Where are we? I gasped, trying to steady my breathing. I looked down. I wasn't standing on a floor. I was standing on a stream of symbols, binary, Sumerian equations I didn't recognize, and DNA sequences. We are inside the information paradox, he explained, walking forward. Every step he took caused the floor to ripple like water. Everything the black hole has ever eaten is stored here. Every book burned in the Library of Alexandria, every lost transmission from a doomed Mars colony, every thought an alien mind ever had before its sun went supernova. It's all here, preserved in the holographic shell of the singularity. He gestured to the vastness around us. This is why the signal went out. The archive is full. It's beginning to leak. And when a black hole leaks, it doesn't just spill data, it spills time. I looked up. In the sky above us, I saw the Acheron 9 station. It was frozen in the moment of its destruction, a million pieces of debris suspended in amber. I saw myself still in the cargo bay, mid-leap. We have to stabilize it, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. That's why you brought me here. To help you manage the data. Not manage it, the older Elias said, his milky eyes turning toward a massive spire of black glass in the distance. To broadcast it. We are going to turn this black hole into a lighthouse. We are going to send the history of the universe back to the beginning, so that the next cycle of the Big Bang doesn't start in the dark. But that will take forever. Exactly. He smiled, a weary, ancient expression. But time is the only thing we have plenty of here. Part 5. The Weaver's Loom. We reached the spire. It wasn't made of glass. It was made of concentrated gravity. It hummed with a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my marrow. This is the transmitter, my older self said. It uses the rotation of the singularity, the frame-dragging effect, to slingshot information across the dimensional barriers. But it requires a pilot. Someone to weave the threads of data into a coherent stream. He led me to a console that looked like a pipe organ made of stars. I have been doing this for what you would call an eternity, he said, his form flickering. I am fading. My time is running out. The signal you heard, the heartbeat, was my life support system failing. I needed you to take over the loom. I sat at the console. As soon as my hands touched the interface, my mind exploded. I wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. I was the memory of 1,000,000,000 civilizations. I felt the heat of 1,000,000,000 suns. I heard the first cries of 1,000 species. I saw the rise and fall of empires that lived and died in the blink of a cosmic eye. Filter it, the older, Elias whispered, his voice sounding distant now. Find the pattern. Send it back. Keep the fire burning. I began to work. My fingers moved with a speed that defied biology. I was no longer just a man, I was a processor. I took the raw, chaotic data of the universe and spun it into a golden thread. I found the signal. The one I had heard on Acheron 9. Pulse. Pause. Pulse. Pulse. I realized I wasn't just sending a heartbeat. I was sending a code. A warning. A map. Cash Shapu, I whispered. Yes, the ghost of my older self replied as he began to dissolve into light. The sorcerer. The one who weaves the spell of time. That's you now, Elias. Keep the signal alive. Someone has to be listening, and then I was alone. Part 6. The Sentinels of Decay. For a time, if time can be said to exist in a place where seconds stretch into eons, I was a god of the loom. I sat at the spire, weaving the history of civilizations into the Singularity's spin. I saw the rise of the Solarian hegemony, the collapse of the Andromeda Dyson spheres, and the silent, cold death of 1,000 watery worlds. But I was not as alone as I thought. The archive had a basement, and in that basement things had grown in the dark. Mina, I called out into the golden haze. My own voice sounded alien to me now, layered with the static of the loom. I am here, Elias, a voice replied. It wasn't the station AI anymore. It was a synthesis of every voice ever recorded in the history of human speech. It sounded like a choir of ghosts. The integrity of the stream is being compromised. Something is eating the footnotes. I looked at the data streams flowing around the spire. They were no longer pure gold. Black streaks, like ink dropped in clear water, were beginning to pollute the information. Where the black touched the light, the data disappeared. Not just deleted, unwritten. What are they? I asked, my fingers flying across the starglass keys to reroute the flow. The Void Eaters, Mina replied. The universe has a fundamental law, entropy. Everything must eventually reach a state of total disorder. But this archive, it is a pocket of perfect order. To the universe, we are a cyst, an infection of memory in a body that wants to forget. Out of the shifting geometry of the archive, they emerged. They didn't have bodies. They were shadows in the shape of geometry, fractal predators that moved by folding the space around them. They were the personification of the second law of thermodynamics. They weren't here to kill me. They were here to consume the meaning of everything I had ever known. If they reached the spire, the signal I had sent to my younger self would be erased. The loop would break. Acheron 9 would never have existed. I would never have been born. Mina, increase the output of the Hawking radiation, I commanded. We need to burn them off. If I do that, Elias, the Singularity will lose mass. The horizon will shrink. We will be crushed by the very walls of our sanctuary. Do it. If there is no memory, there is no point in surviving the crush. The spire began to glow with a blinding ultraviolet light. The heartbeat of the station accelerated. Pulse, 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 pulse. The shadows shrieked, a sound like metal grinding against the vacuum. They dissolved into white ash, but more were coming. Thousands of them rising from the event horizon like locusts. Part 7. The Final Translation. I realized then that I couldn't win a war of attrition against entropy. You cannot fight the end of time by standing still. Mina, I said, my voice calm as the spire groaned under the pressure. How much of the archive have we successfully broadcasted? Approximately 42%, she replied. The rest is still raw data. I saw the faces of people I had never met. Mothers on Earth, explorers on Proxima Centauri, poets on the moons of Jupiter. We're going to compress the file, I said. Compression at that level will cause data loss, Elias. The nuances, the emotions, they will be stripped away. Only the bare logic will remain. Not if I use myself as the codec, I whispered. I stood up from the console and walked toward the central core of the spire, the white hole injector. This was the point where the information was accelerated to the speed of light and flung out of the singularity. Elias, if you enter the injector, your consciousness will be fragmented across the entire broadcast. You will exist everywhere, but you will be nothing. I'll be the signal, Mina. That's what my older self said. I am the signal. I stepped into the light. The sensation was not one of falling, but of expanding. I felt my skin turn into binary. My bones became equations. My memories of Earth. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the taste of a bitter coffee, the sound of my grandfather's laugh became the carrier wave for the history of the cosmos. I was the 1420 megahertz frequency. I was the Kashapu word. I watched as the Acheron 9 station appeared again in the distance of time. I saw the younger Elias Thorne sitting at his desk, lonely and bored, listening to the static of the void. I reached out across the eons. I focused every ounce of my fading self into that one moment. Pulse. Pause. Pulse. Pulse. Listen, Elias, I whispered through the radio of the past. Listen to the ghost in the well. Part 8, The Aftermath of the Echo. Stardate, 2249.04.15. Location, Escape Pod Icarus 1. The pod drifted in the silent wake of the Cocytus Singularity. Behind me, Acheron 9 was gone swallowed by a sudden, violent contraction of the event horizon. I sat in the dark, the only survivor. My senses showed nothing but the cold, indifferent stars of the Bhuta's void. But as I reached for the radio to signal for rescue, a sound came through the speakers. It wasn't a distress call from command. It wasn't the AI. It was a song made of 1 billion voices, singing in 1,000 languages, layered over a heartbeat that sounded remarkably like my own. It was a history book, a map, and a lullaby, all wrapped into a single transmission. The signal wasn't coming from the black hole anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The entire universe was vibrating with the memory of itself. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't need to be rescued. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "I hear you," I whispered to the empty air. "I'm listening. Part 9, The Anatomy of the Archive." When I merged with the spire, I stopped seeing with eyes and started perceiving with probability densities. The interior of Cositus was not just a library of books. It was a library of moments. In the archive, time did not flow like a river. It stood still like a frozen ocean, and I was the diver. Every bubble in that ice was a world, a life, a choice. "Look closer, Elias." The collective voice of Mina whispered within my thoughts. "Do not just broadcast the data. Witness it. The signal requires a witness to be real." I allowed my consciousness to drift into the first thread of the loom. I saw the crystalloids of Vega Prime. They were beings made of living quartz who communicated through the refraction of light. They didn't have words for war or hate, because their minds were linked by the very sun that warmed them. I watched their sun go supernova. I felt the collective shattering of 1 billion glass souls as their atmosphere boiled away. I took that scream of light and I wove it into the signal. Pulse. I moved to the next thread. The hive of M31, a biological machine that spanned 3 solar systems. They had solved hunger, solved death, but they had forgotten how to be alone. I saw the moment a viral thought, a simple paradox, entered their collective mind and caused their entire civilization to go silent in a single afternoon. I took that silence and I wove it into the signal. Pause. I felt the weight of it all. The archive was a graveyard of greatness, but it was also a repository of the mundane. I saw a child on a planet that would be destroyed by a wandering black hole in 3,000 years. She was drawing a flower in the dirt with a stick. I saw a scientist on a dying Earth-like world finally finishing a poem he had been writing for 40 years, just as the oxygen scrubbers failed. "Why?" I asked the void. "Why save these things if they are already gone?" "Because," a voice that sounded like my mother replied from the depths of the loom, "information is the only thing that defies entropy. A star dies, but the fact that it shone is eternal. You are the curator of the eternal fact." Part 10, The Siege of the Fractal Shadows. The Void Eaters, the fractal predators, had breached the inner sanctum. They were not biological. They were sentient mathematical errors, pieces of the universe that wanted to return to the zero state. As I wove the memories of the Vega crystalloids, I felt a cold, jagged edge scrape against my mind. One of the shadows had latched onto the spire. It was a shifting, non-Euclidean shape, a mass of black needles that moved according to the laws of a 4-dimensional geometry. Where it touched the spire, the golden data turned into gray ash. "Elias," Mina's voice flickered. "The predators are eating the 21st century. We are losing the records of the early space age. Apollo 11 is fading. The Voyager probes are being unmade." I felt a surge of panic. If the early records were destroyed, the foundation of the signal would collapse. The Kashapu word would lose its meaning. "How do I fight something that isn't physical?" I cried out, my consciousness straining against the gray rot. You must define it, Mina replied. Give it a value. Give it a limit. I reached out with my mind and grabbed the shadow. I didn't use hands, I used calculus. I began to wrap the shadow in a series of complex equations. I defined its mass, its velocity, its rate of decay. I forced the chaos of the Void Eater into the rigid cage of a Lorentz transformation. I used the fundamental space-time equation as a trap. I shouted the math into the void. I turned the predator into a variable. And then I solved for zero. The shadow shrieked, a sound like 1,000 hard drives crashing at once, and vanished. But for every one I deleted, 10 more emerged from the event horizon. The singularity was leaking the very concept of nothingness. They aren't just eating the past, I realized. The light of the spire dimming, they are eating the future of the signal. They are trying to ensure that when the universe finally dies, there is nothing left to start the next one. Part 11. The Earthly Reception, the year 2251. While I fought in the heart of the hole, time continued its relentless march on the outside. 2 years had passed since the Acheron 9 station disappeared. In the high-altitude observatories of the Andes, a young astronomer named Maya Ishiguro sat, staring at a waterfall of data. She was the one who had taken over Elias Thorne's seat at Central Command. Is it the same interference? Her supervisor asked, leaning over her shoulder. No, Maya whispered. It's changed. It's no longer just a heartbeat. Look. She pointed to the spectral analysis. The signal was now carrying terabytes per millisecond. It was coming through the Cositus wormhole, but it was being broadcast on every known frequency simultaneously. It's a broadcast, Maya said, her eyes wide. It's everything. It's biology, physics, music, history. It's as if someone found the backup drive of the universe and hit send all. The signal didn't just stay in the computers. Because it was being broadcast via gravitational waves, it started to affect the world itself. People began to have echo dreams. They would wake up remembering the smell of flowers from planets 10,000 light years away. Musicians began to play melodies that followed the mathematical laws of Vega Prime. Scientists began to scribble equations for faster-than-light travel that they had found in the static of their radios. Elias Thorne was gone, but his work was rewriting the human soul. Who is doing this? The supervisor asked, terrified. Maya looked at the screen, where a small rhythmic pulse still sat at the base of the data stream. Pulse. Pause. Pulse, pulse. Someone who didn't want us to be alone, she said. Part 12. The Descent into the Singularity Core. Back inside the spire, I was losing the battle against the shadows. The gray rot had covered half of the loom. My memories of my own life were starting to fray. I couldn't remember the color of my mother's eyes. I couldn't remember the name of the girl I had loved in the academy. Mina, I whispered, the light of the spire now a dim, flickering amber. I can't hold it. The entropy is too high. The singularity is closing. There is one final option, Elias, Mina said. Her voice was now just a whisper in the wind of the archive. The singularity core. The point of infinite density. If you take the loom there, you can bypass the time loop entirely. You can broadcast the data not just to the past, but to the beginning. The Big Bang. The singularity that started it all. If you can plant the seed of the archive in the first singularity, the universe will be born with the memory of itself. There will be no need for a signal. The knowledge will be in the DNA of the stars. And what happens to me? Mina was silent for a long time. You will become the law of physics. You will be the reason that light travels at sea. You will be the reason that gravity pulls instead of pushes. You will be the breath of God that the ancients wrote about. I looked at the gray shadows closing in. I looked at the golden threads I had saved. I grabbed the loom, the entire history of everything that ever was, and I dove. I didn't dive into space. I dove into the math. I dove past the event horizon, past the inner horizon, into the ring singularity. The pressure was beyond description. It wasn't physical, it was the pressure of being a single point of consciousness trying to hold 1 trillion lives. I became a sphere, then a line, then a point, and then I exploded. Part 13, Genesis 2.0. Stardate 0.00, lost location, the void before time. There was darkness. And then there was a signal, a single lonely pulse in the void. Pulse. Pause. Pulse, pulse. But this time, there was no one to hear it. Not yet. The pulse contained a blueprint. It contained the instructions for how to build a hydrogen atom. It contained the recipe for a star. It contained the memory of a man named Elias Thorne, and the smell of rain on hot asphalt, and the sound of 1,000 glass bells. The signal expanded. It cooled. It became the cosmic microwave background radiation, the static that every radio in history would eventually pick up. Billions of years later, on a small blue planet, a man would sit in a space station near a black hole. He would hear a strange interference on his senses. He would think it was a ghost. He wouldn't realize he was listening to himself, telling himself to keep going. The cycle was complete. The archive was safe. The universe was no longer just a collection of matter and energy. It was a story, and the story was finally being told. Part 14, The Second Awakening. On Earth, the signal did not simply fade. It became the background noise of existence. Initially, it was called the Thorne anomaly. Scientists at the Unified Space Agency spent decades trying to decode the sheer volume of data pouring out of the Cosida singularity. They found blueprints for gravity drives, yes. They found cures for cellular senescence. But they found something else, something that changed the very definition of being human. They found genetic memory. Children born after the year 2251, the signal generation, began to exhibit strange traits. They didn't just learn history, they remembered it. A child in Tokyo could describe the sulfurous smell of the moons of Jupiter with terrifying accuracy. A girl in Nairobi could solve equations regarding the curvature of space-time before she could read. It was as if Elias, by jumping into the core, had uploaded the archive directly into the human genome. We aren't a single planet anymore. Maya Ishiguro wrote in her final journal entry, 40 years after the disappearance of Acheron 9. We are the vessel. Elias didn't just save the past, he gave us a map to the future. We are no longer wandering in the dark. We are following the heartbeat. By the year 2400, humanity had left the solar system. They didn't go as conquerors, but as pilgrims. They traveled to the coordinates Elias had broadcast, to the ruins of the Vega crystalloids, to the silent hives of M31. They rebuilt what was lost. They became the gardeners of the universe, ensuring that the stories Elias saved would never be forgotten again. Part 15. The Recovered Log, Acheron 9 Black Box. Encrypted data, Recovery Level 9, Clearance Only, Subject, Final Black Box Recording, Outpost Acheron 9, Audio Log Start, Sound of heavy rhythmic metallic thumping. High-pitched feedback. The voice of the AI Mina is distorted, echoing as if speaking through a long tunnel. Mina. Log entry. Unknown. Time. Irrelevant. The pilot has entered the core. The structural integrity of Acheron 9 is at 0.0001%. The event horizon is currently consuming this recording device. I am afraid. Silence for 3 seconds. The sound of a man breathing it is the younger Elias, recorded during his final moments in the cargo bay. Younger Elias, do you hear that, Mina? Behind the sirens. It's not just noise anymore. It's a voice. It sounds like me, but older, like he's been through a war and won. Minna. Calculations suggest the voice is a temporal reflection, a feedback loop caused by the singularity's spin. Elias, you must jump. The math requires it. The universe requires it. Younger Elias. I know. It's funny. I spent my whole life out here listening for a sign that we weren't alone. I never thought I'd be the one answering the call. Sound of a heavy thud, the jump, then a sudden, violent silence. The metallic groaning stops. The sirens stop. The only sound left is a soft, rhythmic pulsing. Minna, whispering, he is gone. No, he is everywhere. I can see the data streams now. They aren't just numbers. They are light. Oh, it's beautiful. I didn't know the vacuum could be so bright. Log terminated. Gravitational shear detected. Part 16. The final frequency. Thousands of years later, at the very edge of the observable universe, a new civilization emerged. They were not human. They were made of gas and magnetic fields, drifting through the nebulae of a young galaxy. They didn't have radios. They didn't have satellites. But they had a sense that allowed them to feel the vibrations of space-time itself. One day, a young member of their species felt a strange ripple. It was a rhythmic, persistent drumming that seemed to come from the very beginning of time. Pulse. Pause. Pulse, pulse. They gathered their elders. They listened to the vibration. They realized it wasn't just noise. It was a structure. It was a foundation. It was the Kashapu, the great weaver, who had laid the tracks for the stars to follow. They didn't know who Elias Thorne was. They didn't know about Earth or Acheron 9. But they felt the warmth of the memory. They felt the love of a man who had traded his soul to ensure that their story, too, would one day be recorded in the archive. The signal was no longer a cry for help. It was a promise. As long as the black holes turned, as long as the stars burned, the memory would remain. The universe was no longer a cold, empty void. It was a library. And the doors were always open. Part 17, Coda, narrator's closing. Narrator should speak in a low, fading whisper, almost like a secret. If you go out into the desert on a clear night, far from the lights of the cities, and you turn your radio to the empty space between the stations, you might hear it. The hiss of the cosmic microwave background. The static of the Big Bang. Listen closely. Beyond the white noise. Beyond the solar winds, there is a heartbeat. Pulse. Pause. Pulse, pulse. It is Elias still weaving. It is the signal still calling. It is us still listening.